2012, Norwegian Air Shuttle, a tiny low-cost carrier that had been hours away from bankruptcy just a decade earlier, makes a stunning announcement that shocks the entire aviation industry. They're ordering over 300 brand new jets from Boeing and Airbus. And not just narrow-bodies either, they're betting they can make premium long-haul operations work at budget prices, despite never operating a single wide-body before. Wall Street called them visionary. Aviation analysts said they were rewriting the rules of low-cost aviation. But financial experts saw something else. A company financing almost 90% of its assets with borrowed money. A strategy that could only work if absolutely nothing went wrong. And then, everything went wrong. Within just a few years, Norwegian went from being Europe's hottest airline story to desperately firing 90% of its workforce just to stay afloat. Their stock collapsed by 85%. Their CEO was gone. And every single long-haul aircraft they'd bet their future on had been returned to lessors. But here's what makes this story so devastating. Norwegian didn't fail because of one mistake. They failed because of a perfect storm of disasters that hit them all at once. Problems they should have anticipated but were too ambitious to see coming. This is the story of Norwegian Air's spectacular rise and catastrophic fall. And the billion-dollar lesson about what happens when a budget airline tries to compete with the giants on borrowed money. When the airline began operations in 1993, it wasn't even intended to be an independent carrier. The company existed solely as a regional feeder service for Brothens, a well-established Norwegian airline with deep roots in Scandinavian aviation. At the time, Norwegian operated with just 3 Fokker 50 turboprops, aircraft they had inherited from an even older, bankrupt regional carrier called Miserably, which had served the same shuttle role since the 1960s. The business model was simple and sustainable. Norwegian would operate short regional routes, connecting smaller Norwegian cities to Brothen's hub network on a contractual basis. The airline didn't need to worry about marketing, route planning, or competition. Brothens handled all of that. Norwegian's job was straightforward: maintain reliable service, keep costs under control, and feed passengers into Brothen's long-haul network. For nearly a decade, this arrangement worked beautifully. Norwegian's fleet gradually grew to 6 Fokker 50s. The airline was profitable, management was competent, and operations ran smoothly. In fact, many of the original crew members had come from Miserably, bringing decades of experience and institutional knowledge. But this comfortable arrangement was about to be shattered in a way that would fundamentally alter Norwegian's trajectory forever. While Norwegian prospered in its limited role, its partner Brothens was struggling. By 1999, Brothens had begun consolidating operations to stem mounting losses, but these efforts only accelerated its decline. Then, in 2001, Scandinavian Airline System, the powerful flag carrier for the Scandinavian countries, stepped in to acquire the failing airline. For SAS, this acquisition made strategic sense. They would eliminate a competitor and gain valuable route rights and airport slots while further strengthening their grip in the Nordic region. For Brothens, it was a desperate lifeline. But there was one problem. While SAS was interested in acquiring Brothens Airlines, it had absolutely no interest in maintaining Brothens' existing feeder arrangements. In fact, they already operated their own subsidiary, SAS Commuter, and saw no reason to outsource regional operations to an independent carrier like Norwegian Air Shuttle. Norwegian assumed that they would get an 18-month notice period for any modifications to their operational arrangements, a provision explicitly outlined in their existing agreement with Brothens. However, in November 2001, when SAS unilaterally terminated that contract with immediate effect, Norwegian was devastated, leaving them no transitional period while their entire airline operation was left hanging by a thread. Most regional carriers facing this scenario would have simply shut down or been acquired. But the Norwegian leadership wasn't ready to accept defeat. Instead of giving up, they made a decision that would have seemed insane to any rational observer. If SAS wouldn't let them join the system, they would compete directly against it. However, Norwegian's management quickly realized that continuing as a traditional regional carrier was futile. They came up with a solution by observing a trend that was sweeping across Europe in the late 1990s and early 2000s: the low-cost carrier revolution. Airlines like Ryanair and EasyJet had demonstrated that a fundamentally different approach to airline operations could succeed even against the big legacy carriers. So, Norwegian decided to reinvent itself entirely, transforming from a regional feeder into a low-cost carrier. They started by replacing their 6 small Fokker F-50s with a leased fleet of Boeing 737-300s and later a few older ND-80s. These aircraft allowed Norwegian to adopt the low-cost playbook: high aircraft utilization, quick turnarounds, point-to-point routes, and no-frills service. They stripped away complimentary meals and simplified operations while focusing relentlessly on keeping costs down. The gamble paid off. Within a few years, Norwegian had become one of the most recognized budget airlines in Europe. But soon they faced a crucial decision that every successful low-cost carrier eventually confronts. You see, when the airline is small and testing routes, it makes sense to operate cheap, older aircraft. If a route doesn't work out, the airline can ground those planes without losing massive amounts of money. But as the carrier grows, it needs to switch to newer, more efficient jets, even though these cost far more money up front. This is one of the most dangerous moments for any low-cost carrier. Moving from low-risk older planes to expensive new aircraft completely changes the stakes. If things go wrong, the consequences are much bigger, and many budget airlines have failed at exactly this stage. The question for Norwegian was whether they could make this jump successfully. These videos take a lot of time and research to create, so if you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel. Confident in their strategy, Norwegian made yet another bold move. In 2008, they began replacing their older 737-300s and MD-80s with brand new Boeing 737-800s while simultaneously expanding their route network. They maintained an average load factor around 80%. Not quite as high as industry leaders like Ryanair or EasyJet, but substantially better than most traditional airlines. But then came 2010, and everything changed. Norwegian ordered their first Boeing 787 Dreamliners to launch low-cost, long-haul operations to North America, a decision that would come to haunt them later. You see, low-cost, long-haul operations are exceptionally rare in the budget airline industry, and for good reason. Consider the operational complexities. Wide-body aircraft like the 787 require substantially higher maintenance costs than the single-aisle jets that dominate low-cost fleets. These complex twin-aisle aircraft demand specialized technicians, expensive spare parts, and lengthier maintenance checks. Costs that directly undermine the low-cost business model. Norwegian's approach to this challenge was characteristically aggressive. Unlike their gradual short-haul fleet evolution, they planned to jump straight into long-haul with brand new 787s, skipping the usual phase of operating older wide-bodies. They were essentially trying to rewrite the rules of low-cost aviation entirely, making premium long-haul routes work at budget prices by nailing efficiency. But they didn't stop there. What happened next was extraordinary, even by the standards of Norwegian's ambitious growth trajectory. In 2012, while operating fewer than 70 aircraft total, Norwegian announced orders that stunned the aviation industry. 100 Boeing 737 MAX 8s, plus 22 additional 737-800s. Then, before the industry had fully processed that news, they announced another 100 Airbus A320neo family jets with 50 additional options, plus 30 long-range Airbus A321LRs to their existing order. To put this in perspective, Norwegian had ordered more than 300 aircraft while operating a fleet of just 70 jets. For a low-cost carrier that had existed for barely a decade, these orders represented a staggering bet on continued growth. But according to Norwegian's leadership, this strategy was more sophisticated than simple fleet expansion. By ordering 737 next-generation aircraft to replace their classics, while simultaneously ordering 737 MAX jets to replace those next-gen planes eventually, they created a rolling modernization cycle to keep the fleet as young as possible. At the same time, they were building a separate wide-body operation with 787s and planning to deploy A321LRs on long-haul routes where the 787 was too large to fill profitably. Perhaps most strategically, they created a leasing company called Arctic Aviation Assets so that they could lease the aircraft with other carriers if these jets were delivered before Norwegian actually needed them. On the surface, it looked like brilliant strategic planning. In reality, it was a house of cards built on a foundation of debt. While Norwegian's growth story captivated aviation enthusiasts and attracted media attention, financial analysts were growing increasingly alarmed by what they saw in the company's balance sheets. By 2016, Norwegian's equity ratio stood at just 11% compared to European low-cost carriers like EasyJet and Ryanair, which maintained equity ratios well above 50%. In layman's terms, a low equity ratio means the company's assets are mostly financed by borrowed money rather than shareholder investment. This meant that Norwegian's strategy could only work if everything went according to plan, and even a temporary setback could quickly cascade into a crisis. And that's exactly what happened. The first cracks appeared with the Boeing 787 aircraft, which was supposed to be the cornerstone of their transatlantic expansion. But within just the first month of operations, repeated technical faults began stranding passengers on multiple routes. For a new long-haul operator without the global maintenance infrastructure, these weren't just delays, they were operational crises. As a result, Norwegian had no choice but to pull the Dreamliner from long-haul service and demanded Boeing fix it. Because, in their words, the reliability simply wasn't acceptable. To maintain their transatlantic schedule, Norwegian was forced to wet lease the older Airbus A340s and even an Airbus A380. While the poor fuel efficiency of these jets devastated Norwegian, wet leasing, where another airline provides both aircraft and crew to solve short-term operational gaps, proved extraordinarily expensive. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. In 2016, All Nippon Airways discovered corrosion-related fatigue cracks in the Rolls-Royce Trent 1000 engines installed on their 787 fleet. Within months, it became apparent that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a fundamental design flaw affecting Trent 1000s across the entire global fleet. Airlines across the industry, including Norwegian, had no choice but to ground their Dreamliners for emergency repairs. The repair bottleneck that followed was inevitable. Rolls-Royce alone had the specialized knowledge to rectify these engine defects, but with limited technicians and repair infrastructure, they simply couldn't process the volume of engines that needed attention. Norwegian had to implement a rolling maintenance schedule, grounding a part of its fleet in phases over several years while anxiously monitoring the engines on jets that remained in service. The financial impact was devastating. In 2017, just 1 year after posting their largest profit in company history, Norwegian reported a massive $240 million loss. While Norwegian was still reeling from the Dreamliner disaster, a new problem emerged. As we mentioned earlier, their leasing subsidiary, Arctic Aviation Assets, had ordered Airbus A320neo aircraft equipped with Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan engines. These new engines promised dramatic fuel efficiency improvements, but early operational experience revealed serious reliability problems. Airlines operating aircraft with these GTF engines began experiencing compressor blade failures, unscheduled engine removals, and extended groundings for corrective maintenance. The consequence was brutal. They couldn't find any airlines willing to lease these aircraft, which meant that the brand new A320neos being delivered went directly from the factory into storage, generating zero revenue while Norwegian continued paying for them. Now, any rational management team facing these accumulating problems would have paused expansion plans and focused on stabilizing existing operations. But Norwegian's leadership did the opposite. Instead of scaling back, they sold and then leased back several of their jets to generate immediate cash while increasing long-term obligations. Then, in a move that defied all logic, they proceeded with plans to launch yet another completely new subsidiary airline in Argentina, which began operations in October 2018. However, by now, their luck had run out, and what followed was a catastrophe that Norwegian's management couldn't have anticipated: the worldwide grounding of the Boeing 737 MAX following 2 devastating crashes. At the time, Norwegian was operating 18 MAX aircraft with many more scheduled for delivery. They were counting on these MAX jets to replace older 737NGs and support the continued growth needed to offset their earlier losses. Instead, these new jets sat idle while Norwegian kept making payments on them, and their carefully constructed expansion timeline, already strained by earlier setbacks, became completely untenable. It took several months for Norwegian's management to publicly acknowledge reality. When they finally did, the shift was dramatic. In July 2019, Bjorn Kjos, the CEO who had led Norwegian for 17 years and orchestrated its transformation from regional feeder to low-cost giant, resigned. His departure marked the end of Norwegian's growth era and the beginning of what would become a desperate fight for survival. The airline immediately shifted into crisis mode. They shut down Norwegian Air Argentina after barely a year of operation and began returning aircraft to lessors while postponing new deliveries. But these measures came too late. Following Kjos's departure, the company's stock had lost a massive 85% of its value compared to just 12 months earlier. Some investors still hoped a larger airline group might acquire Norwegian, providing a much-needed capital infusion to stabilize operations. But that hope evaporated entirely in the spring of 2020 when COVID-19 emerged, and the global aviation industry collapsed overnight. When the pandemic hit, Norwegian terminated 7,300 employees across various subsidiaries, representing almost 90% of the group's total workforce, just to stay afloat. While the Norwegian government provided some pandemic relief to the core Norwegian Air Shuttle entity, other Scandinavian governments weren't very sympathetic. Sweden, for instance, refused to support Norwegian's recovery plans, rightly pointing out that the airline's financial crisis had clearly begun long before COVID-19 and that their reckless expansion was entirely to blame. Eventually, after intense negotiations with governments and creditors, Norwegian secured the support needed to avoid complete liquidation, but only after announcing drastic restructuring measures that would leave the airline a shadow of its former self. Norwegian's fleet was slashed from 140 aircraft to just 50, and all long-haul operations ceased entirely, with every Boeing 787 returned to lessors. Moreover, the Airbus widebody orders were cancelled. Even the 737 MAX aircraft, which had finally returned to service, were sent back to lessors in favor of cheaper-to-lease 737-800s. The airline that had once dreamed of competing with legacy carriers on a global scale was forced to retreat to its Scandinavian roots. As of 2026, Norwegian's fleet has grown back to almost 97 aircraft, including some 737 MAX 8s, and since the restructuring, Norwegian Group has successfully transformed from a struggling global carrier into a profitable, lean regional leader in the Nordic market. In fact, the airline reported its highest ever quarterly profit in Q3 2025, with an operating profit of almost $250 million. For Norwegian Air, the lesson was expensive and painful. Ambition without financial discipline is a recipe for disaster. For a decade, they executed a near-perfect low-cost carrier playbook, but they couldn't resist chasing growth beyond what their financial structure could support, proving that sustainable growth beats explosive expansion every single time.